Welcome back to SPED 738. In this module, we're taking a look at learning disabilities and what students with learning disabilities, the characteristics that typically present themselves. So you've looked initially at a short video just kind of defining learning disabilities, defining characteristics in general. What I want to do now over this next series of 3 videos is take a look at more detail at exactly what dyslexia is, and then we'll take a look at what a disability in mathematics looks like, and then spend some time looking at response to intervention and how we use that process to identify students with learning disabilities. So when we look at dyslexia, it's really important for us to kind of understand the characteristics of students with dyslexia, understand the characteristics of a good reader, and those characteristics that are really impacting students that are struggling to be successful readers. And look at how we assess reading skills. There's a variety of tools that we can use. And then we will, in the next video, spend some time really looking at that response to intervention concept and how we implement that in the classroom and look at some classroom interventions. So when we look at defining dyslexia, dyslexia is basically a severe difficulty in learning how to read. And typically, students who have dyslexia, the origin of that disability is really a neurological processing disorder when it comes to reading. When we look at reading, reading's a pretty complicated process when we think about it. And our students with dyslexia typically start off with some kind of phonological deficit. So they have either difficulty with letter sounds, with difficulty then with word recognition because they struggle with those letter sounds. It also creates a real issue for decoding words that are not known to them. And then that translates into poor spelling. So these are things you've probably seen with students with dyslexia. That primary deficit is going to be in phonological deficit. Now what we've found is that students with that phonological deficit have these secondary consequences that really impact learning in the classroom. One of those is reading comprehension. Because they have difficulty with word recognition, they have a challenge in decoding. Typically what we see is these students are not fluent readers, so they're reading at a much slower pace, and that impacts reading comprehension. They also don't have the strategies in place to ask themselves questions during the reading process and really build those reading comprehension skills. It's something we'll take a look at here in a little bit. But the other secondary consequence of this is that these students really have a reduced reading experience. So reading's a challenge. Typically they don't like to read because it's hard, and so they read less. And what that means is as you read less, your gains in reading plateau, or they're not matching their typical neurologically developing peers. Okay, so there's really 3 things going on here that are really impacting students in the classroom with reading. When we look specifically at what a phonological deficit is, here we're talking about several things. We're talking about phonemes. So do students understand how speech sounds are organized and used within language? To give you a really easy example, do they understand that when you put a C and a H together, they make the sound ch? They don't sound like k-huh. They have that combined sound. So the students have a really good understanding of those speech sounds. And when we talk about phonological development, these are usually skills that we're learning in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, learning how those sounds go together and how we understand how they go together is really critical for students. And so students that have dyslexia really have some neurological processing issues there with being able to put those sounds together, to being able to hear those sounds together and really understand them, identify them in words. And so what we have found is that students that have this difficulty in understanding phonemes really have difficulty with word recognition, which makes sense. You know, these are kind of the building blocks of reading. In a little bit, we're going to talk about building blocks of math. What we're talking about here are the building blocks of reading. These are the essential skills that students need to understand how to read. So really grasping those speech sounds and understanding those phonemes is critical for them to be successful readers. Now, when we look at kind of the developmental steps of the phonological processes, this is a document that I go to a lot because it talks about patterns of sounds and kind of when we're looking at a phonological disorder for students, how do we determine that? What kinds of things are they doing within their reading and with sounds? And also, what's kind of the appropriate age of when they stop maybe making those errors in sounds? I think that's also important for us to realize. And so this kind of outlines some of those issues that students can have. So when we talk about, for example, substitution, okay, here we're talking about maybe the word rabbit, substituting the R with a W sound, so saying wabbit. That's called gliding when we're talking about substitution. Typically at 6 years of age, we start to hear children stop doing those gliding substitutions, okay? Most of these occur really around the 6-year mark. In kindergarten, you're still going to see students making some of these errors. By first grade, we typically see any kind of substitution with sounds stopping. So if you're working with a first grader or second grader who's still making some of those substitution for letter sounds that you're seeing in the classroom, it's important to really address those because they're having an issue with that pattern of sounds. They're still making errors within their patterns of sounds. The other thing that we see sometimes is assimilation. So here is when maybe a consonant sound starts to sound like another sound in a word. So bub for bus is one of the examples they used. Or when you're voicing a consonant at the beginning of the word, it's substituted with a different voice consonant. So like if we're trying to make a K or an F sound, that's a real typical one that students will struggle with. They'll substitute that with a G or a V. So like comb is the example here. They might say gome. Okay, at 6 years of age, we typically see that stop. The other issue that we can see is when students have some syllable structure issues. And if you think about decoding skills and really putting syllables together, sounding words out, this can be a real barrier for students when they're learning how to read. So a typical one that we see in kindergarten, maybe they're still doing, is when a consonant cluster is reduced to maybe a single consonant. So like plane, they say pain, okay? Typically, by 5 years, they stop doing that with the S sound. Another one that you'll see often in school, because most of these we see in early grades like pre-K, but one that we can see all the way up to 8 years is when a sound is added between two consonants. So typically the sound. So they'll say like baloo for blue, baloo for blue, okay? And that also impacts their reading, also impacts their spelling, because if you think about they're sounding out that word to spell, if you see students spelling the word blue, for example, with B-U-L-U-E, or adding some U's in there where they're not supposed to be, this is a real good example of a syllable structure issue for a student. Some of the other factors that can really impact student reading is kind of what they call a naming speed deficit. So this is a common deficit that we see in students who have dyslexia, and they have trouble rapidly retrieving kind of a spoken word when they see it in print, okay? So just that retrieval that's occurring neurologically within the brain, making that connection to the word. That's why it's really good to work on things like word walls, to work on sight words. Those kinds of things are really helpful for students who have a deficit in this area because it helps them kind of make those neurological connections to increase that naming speed, which is so critical. The other thing that we often see for students with dyslexia is this orthographic deficit. There's not a lot of research that's been done on this, but this really is talking about a deficit in the patterns in written language. So, you know, also impacts spelling and those kinds of things, and how students are putting words together to make some written work. So one of the things we want to talk about is also reading comprehension. We've talked about phonemic awareness and how that impacts learners, but when we're looking at reading comprehension, there's so much that goes into how a student successfully is comprehending what they're reading. And it's really under 4 areas. The first is fluency. So here we're getting back to some of that phonemic awareness, but are they decoding things accurately? Is there accuracy in their reading? Do they have that phonemic awareness? Is their reading rate appropriate for their age? So are they reading the right number of words per minute on average with their peers to be able to increase their comprehension? The other piece of reading comprehension is language. So did the students have the vocabulary necessary to really comprehend what they're reading? Do they have tools that they can fall back on if there is a term that they don't understand to determine what that word is, and make those connections within their language? And then do they have knowledge of language structures? So do they understand kind of the concept of subject and verb? We were just talking about this in parent conferences this week with my daughter Josie, who has a hearing impairment. So for her, phonemic awareness is really challenging because she really only hears about 20% of those sounds within our language. So a lot of her reading is done through memorization, through using tools within the book. So using the pictures to help her identify what that word could be. And so we were talking about her really having trouble kind of making inferences about the context of what she's reading about if she comes across a word she doesn't understand. And so we were talking about how important it is for her to understand the concepts of subject and verb and adjectives and making the connection of where those are in the sentence. And one of the examples that the teacher used is they were reading a book that said the raccoon crawls into the hole. It had a picture of a raccoon starting to go into this little hole in the ground. And Josie did not know the word crawl. She couldn't figure out what that word was. And the teacher talked about how important it was for her to understand the subject is the raccoon. What's the next word that's probably going to come after the subject? It's going to be a verb. So what is that raccoon doing? Let's look at the picture. Oh, the raccoon's crawling into the hole. So really making those connections about language structure is really important for reading comprehension. The other thing is just really being able to connect students within their comprehension process to prior knowledge, to knowledge they have about text, whether they're reading nonfiction, fiction, folk tales, whatever it is that they're reading, having that background knowledge that they can build on, also life experience that they can build on, is really critical for reading comprehension. And then the last one is metacognition. So here we're talking about motivation and engagement to read, right? Do they have reading strategies that they're actively implementing? For example, with Josie, that example I gave, she really didn't have any kind of reading strategy she was going to use independently when she came to that word that was challenging that she didn't know. And then do they kind of have monitoring strategies that they do independently? Are they asking themselves some comprehension questions as they're reading to make sure they're comprehending what they're reading? So you can see if you have a student with some phonemic issues, some delays in phonemic awareness, and then you add all of these steps that we see here for reading comprehension, it can be a real challenge to be a successful reader. And that's why as special educators, it's so important for us to really pinpoint where the gaps are in the student's reading ability and really target with specific instruction building these skills that we see here that influence reading comprehension. When we talk about assessing reading skills, there's a number of tools that we can use. Those of you that are at the elementary level, I'm sure you're familiar with graded word lists. You might have the third grade sight word list that students are working through. I've got one here on sight words. Let's see here. Level 1 sight words, age 6 and up, 96 cards. And this is off Dolch and Fry sight words. So these kinds of things are a good way to assess reading skills. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? But when we're talking about reading, there's lots of pieces to the puzzle. So we want to use a variety of assessments to really identify where students are. Another test that a lot of schools use is MAP testing, and that typically starts first grade, kindergarten, first grade. Sometimes schools wait until third to do MAP testing. But that can give us a real clear picture of what areas within reading that the student is struggling with and a really good understanding of what their reading level is. Then we have some tests like the Woodcock-Johnson that school psychologists will often give. That's a diagnostic test that really helps us pinpoint where those gaps are and where the most critical area of deficit is for the student. When I taught elementary school, we used curriculum-based measurements a lot. We did DIBELS in DeSoto, and at the beginning of the year, we would go through a school-wide curriculum-based measurement assessment process where we would really look at where every student was within DIBELS on their reading level and really be grouping students by ability level, and then we would track their progress through the year to make sure that they were making appropriate progress on those curriculum-based measurements. It was really an important tool for us to not only identify students that were struggling with reading, but really track that progress and make sure that they were making appropriate progress. And then you can do informal reading assessments. You can develop some questions of your own about comprehension that you can ask students. You can use a close procedure. That's one that I really liked to use, where students were kind of filling in usually a worksheet with some words missing out of the reading passage, and gave me some good information on their comprehension, on their decoding skills, things like that. So when we look at determining instructional reading level, I think this is so important for those of us who are teaching K to 12th grade, and especially those middle school secondary teachers that are really working more with content learning by reading and textbooks and reading and comprehending textbooks. It's so important for us to know what the student's instructional reading level is, and I always think it's helpful to keep these percentages in mind when you're looking at instructional reading levels. So when we give students a comprehension assessment, we know that that instructional reading level is appropriate if they're at 75% or higher on their comprehension questions. Now, if we're below 75%, we know that that text that we are using is too challenging for the student to use on an instructional basis. Okay? They're going to reach that frustration level. It's really important for us to understand that. If we want students to be doing independent reading for, say, accelerated reader, it's important that we're directing them to books that they can really get that 90 to 100% on those comprehension assessments. We look at this a lot in our house because we have kids at home that are doing AR tests, and Josie right now is consistently at 70%. I had the conversation with her, let's pick some books that are a little bit easier to read, because those are proving to be a challenge. We want her to be up around that 90% on her AR tests, so that we know that her independent reading that she's doing is more at that independent level and not at a frustration level. There are all kinds of programs out there that you can use to instruct students on some of these specific skills that we've talked about, whether it's phonemic awareness or comprehension skills. And we could spend the whole course on different types of interventions and reading programs. I wanted to point out a couple to you that are really research-based and that are appropriate for kind of our students 4th grade on up, because I think that's an area where we really struggle with providing reading instruction. Our kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade teachers, they're pretty comfortable with teaching reading skills like phonemic awareness because that's what they're doing in those grades. But as you get up into the middle school and high school ages, we still have students who have a deficit in that area, but as teachers, our training is not necessarily specific to reading instruction. So that's why I picked a couple of these out. When we look at response to intervention, I'm going to identify for you some resources that are out there that are really repositories of interventions, reading programs that you can use to really identify a program that best fits the student you're working with and the deficit you're trying to address. But this one here is called the Corrective Reading Program. It's been around for a long time. It's a very prescriptive program for students 4th through 12th grade to work on phonemic awareness. And the reason I like this is because it is very prescriptive for students, even into high school, to still continue to work on those phonemic awareness skills, to work on the ability to attack a word, to sound it out, to think about what sounds are in the word. And then also, in the example that you see here, very specific instruction on how to make inferences about what you're reading. So this program has been around for a long time. I believe since the early 90s. There's been a lot of research done with it. It's proven to be very successful. And I'm not always big on suggesting programs that you have to buy or invest in, because I like to find free resources, but sometimes it's beneficial to do that, especially in something like reading. That's a complex activity for our students. There's a lot of complex skills involved with teaching a student how to be a successful reader. And especially when we're working with those students 4th through 12th grade who have maybe had a lot of frustration in reading and still need to work on some of that phonemic awareness, some of those basic skills. But we need material that we can work on that with them that's age appropriate. So that's why I like this program. You'll notice it very clearly lays out what the teacher is going to do and how the teacher walks the student through the process. For example, on this one, they're talking about word attack skills. So how to sound out words, how to talk about the different sounds within the word with the student. And then the second example here is on inferences. So they give a statement called that says population in the air increases every year. They ask the student to say that statement. And then they start asking questions about how can we make inferences off of this sentence. Okay, when does pollution increase in the air? Well, it says it increases every year. What increases in the air every year? Pollution. Really teaches them to ask themselves those comprehension questions. Great program if you work with students in this age range. Another common strategy out there to help students with comprehension is called the Dissect strategy, and this is out of the Center for Research on Learning at the University of Kansas. They've spent a considerable amount of time really researching strategies that help struggling readers. And they provide certification programs and workshops during the summer if it's something you're interested in, that really provide detailed instruction on how to do these strategies and interventions in your classroom. If you work with students that really struggle in this area, I would encourage you to take a look at some of their resources, because they've got some really great resources out there. And the reason I like them is because they've done a lot of research to see how effective it is. And they're not going to have anything out there that research has not shown has been effective. But this one's called the Dissect strategy. So this is how do we solve a problem if we come to a word we don't know. And having a strategy for students is so important. Just like with Josie. She's not quite ready for this yet, but someday this would be a great strategy for her to really solve some word issues as she's reading. So the D is discover the context of the word. So you want to think about what you're reading around that word. Isolate the word's prefix. Separate the word's suffix and say the word stem. So, for example, on renewal, they're using that example. So underlining those 3 letters if the stem begins with a consonant. So underlining new, okay? And then check with another person to see if you're correct, or try finding the word in the dictionary. So really help students break down the sounds within the word, those prefixes, connecting to the context. Just really good strategy for our older students to use when they're solving some words that they don't know. We'll take a break here, and you'll pick up in the next video on response to intervention.